We're down at my gallery in Rye on the south coast of England, and I'm going to show you one of my pictures that's been very popular, which I'd like to try and recreate. It's Littlestone sunrise, shot just a few miles from here, pretty much in midsummer. I'd been there all night photographing the moon setting on the other side of the sky, and as I was about to leave, I noticed the sun coming up over here. So I stayed and got much better pictures than the moon pictures in the end. Strangely, this is a picture that people keep asking me if it's backlit. They think it's a light box with a print stuck on the front. And I promise you it's not. Look, it's canvas. I think it's probably just down to the luminosity of the colours. I print them myself, so I have very great control over the appearance, how dense the blacks are, how bright the highlights are, the colour balance and the rest. And I think perhaps the black frame gives the impression that there's some kind of structure going on underneath, but it's not. It's just a regular picture. But I take that as a compliment. I'm here just before dawn on a beautiful July morning. It's surprisingly cold for 4:45 a.m. In fact, bang on dawn. And I'm here to photograph the sunrise. I'm hoping to recreate the picture I sell in the gallery called Littlestone Sunrise, which was taken pretty much exactly at this time of year, after I'd been here overnight photographing the moon setting over there. We already have a beautiful pink sky, quite a build-up of cloud, but crucially on the horizon over there it's just about clear, so we should see the sun come up. I'm heading up the beach because I'm hoping to find an area of wet sand. The tide is on its way out, and if we can get some wet sand, we'll get some lovely reflections of the sky in the water. You can see the sky is getting brighter and brighter over there. Lovely, the tide's just gone out, so the sand's still wet, giving us nice reflections. There's a slightly larger, there's the first piece of the sun coming up. I should be set up really by now. I'm focusing on the sand in the foreground to make sure it's sharp right down to the bottom of the frame, and I have stopped down to f9. I'm just trying to decide where to put the horizon. I think I'm going to put it slightly lower than the bottom half. There's an interesting bank of cloud with a sliver of light along the horizon. I'm going to head up the beach in a minute, I think, and try and photograph that, but from here I'll give it a try, zoomed in quite a bit. So I've got that post at one end, the sun kind of 2/3 of the way along. The 2-second self-timer as usual, make sure the camera's nice and steady. Before I move from here, I'm going to try some on a very wide lens and see how that looks. I'm going to use my 16-35 f4 zoom. I'm going to set manual exposure for this. It's really quite tricky to do the metering in this situation where the sun is so intensely bright in the middle. I may have to bracket higher and lower than the stated exposure that the camera recommends. So I'm stopping it right down here. And I think I'm going to shoot at around a 50th or a 60th of a second, f9. As usual, I'm focusing really quite near to the camera, round about this area here. I'm hoping that will keep everything sharp right down to the bottom of the frame and in the corners, and the far distance should take care of itself. It's a reasonable depth of field. I'm heading up the beach now to an area where it's slightly wider, giving me a bigger area of reflections to work with, but also this marker post at the end of the groins may be useful as a compositional device. At the moment the sun is very intense, straight into my face. I think would be hard to expose with, so I don't think I'm missing anything right now. But I'd like to get there pretty quickly. Now, as I move across here, the streak of sunlight is getting much, much bigger across the sand. That's what I was hoping for. See it coming right up to the foreground here. Now, what if I duck down? Does it get even longer? It does, doesn't it? It's quite nice. Let's try a shot here. Unfortunately, the sun's moving behind the clouds. But as it works its way up, I think it might put in a reappearance, so we should stay here, keep an eye on what happens. I'm going to put the camera right down, I think. Even though the sun is somewhat muted behind the cloud, it's casting lovely warm reflections over the wet sand. I'm shooting at 100th of a second at f10, which is about 2 stops less than the camera thinks, because the highlight of the sun is so intensely bright. I don't want to overexpose it. I've been shooting at the 35mm end of the zoom range, but as I zoom out, I find that there's a rather interesting patch of light in the top corner up there, which I'm going to try and balance with the stuff down at the bottom. It's quite hard to compose this, so emphatically everything is over to the right, but I think perhaps because the sliver of light on the horizon is over to the left, it might balance up reasonably well. What's quite hard to do here is to judge the level of the horizon, which will probably need correcting in Lightroom. I'm checking my focus. 100th of a second at f10 again. I'm going to try a vertical shot now. See if this little patch of light on the sand can amount to anything interesting. I've switched to the display on the back of the camera here. It's getting hard to look through the viewfinder at such a low angle. The big bank of cloud is moving this way. So we're now starting to get some blue over in the left-hand side. It's making it somewhat easier to compose. I've just done 2 exposures of this. The 100th of a second at f10 looked about right for most of the scene, but the sun and the area around it was still very bright. So I've tried another at 200ths just to see if that gives us a little bit more detail in the highlights. There's a completely amazing sky happening up here. There's a large area of wet beach, which I'm hoping will provide a good foreground. It sort of seems to be falling into place a bit here. It's quite nice. Let's try it around here. This is on 16mm, and I'm going to set my exposure to around about 125th of a second at f8. As I always tend to, I'm focusing on the beach again rather than allowing the camera to also focus on the far distance. I'll point it out. It's kind of this area here. So all the little small stones and rocks and things should be sharp down at the bottom and then all the way into the corners of the frame. And another frame framing up slightly, so we get more sky, less beach. Just turning around, I noticed that the sky is doing some pretty interesting stuff over here. Doesn't have the central bright point of the sun, but it's worth looking at. Rather less bright, so I'm going to go for 50th of a second at f8. This time I won't focus quite as close. I'll focus on that marker post. I've moved further down the beach because the sand is much wetter here, the tide having just gone out. We're getting much stronger reflections. As I thought, the rain is moving across the hills in the distance, right in front of the sun. While the rain itself over the hills is a really interesting detail, I think the overall scene, with the shape of the cloud and its reflection on the beach, is perhaps the more interesting, so I'm sticking with that for now. I'm going to do a quick panorama. I've done the settings on the camera, I'm shooting manually, so both frames will have identical exposures, which is a 200th of a second at f9. So first frame here, I pan the camera right slightly, nice big overlap. Then take the second frame. Then, so I don't get confused when I'm processing these pictures, I make it clear that the two pictures just taken belong together by holding up two fingers in front and photographing that. That means the previous two shots belong together, shot at the same time, same exposures, and will make a successful panorama if stitched together. I'm searching around now for interesting shapes and patterns. I think I found a nice spot here where these two shapes are mirroring one another, the boards in the foreground and the cliff in the distance. Also got some nice ripples on the sand here. I just want to talk a bit about how I would compose a shot like this. There are two very distinct elements, the cloud and the sea defence in the foreground. And the temptation is to kind of zoom in and photograph those. But I favour this kind of picture being fairly broad, particularly given that I like doing big prints of them. It allows you to examine the foreground area, and you have this feeling of being able to walk into the scene, which you only really get if you include a good bit of the foreground. Something else happening here too, which is these gentle ripples on the sand down at the bottom. Well, the sun is now well and truly out, and I think that may be it for our sunrise. There's just too much glare now on the beach. Maybe a few more frames while it just gets brighter and brighter. So eventually, none of the pictures I took were really anything like the Littlestone sunrise I'd been planning to recreate. But I got some nice shots, and I'm pretty happy with them. I think this teaches us one of the basic principles of landscape photography, is that by nature it is unpredictable. We've no idea what the weather and the light will do. Out here the tide's yet another variable. It's always worth coming just to see what's happening. You never know what you're going to get.